Well, if we're going to remake Alien again, at least no one in this episode went out of their way to say, "You bitch." Hello, interwebs. I hope you are all doing well, because I am here to review what is quickly becoming my favorite science fiction series of the year. That is Alien Earth, this one, Season 1, Episode 5, In Space, No One presumably can hear you scream. But who else? Maybe have sex? No one can hear you have sex? I mean, yeah, I guess you scream during sex. Anyways, all of that is relevant in this episode. I'm going to be kind of frank. I'm really interested to see what the discourse on this episode is ultimately going to be. But for me, I think this is such an interesting comparison piece to the recent Alien film, Alien Romulus, because a lot of the discussion coming out of that movie, and it was a movie that I rather liked, but the biggest criticism of it was that it was ultimately hewing very closely to the original Ridley Scott Alien film and redoing a lot of the same beats. And I frankly don't 100% agree with that assessment of that movie, but I think people rightly got that impression for how many fan service callbacks that movie did. Right down to the fact, like, there was the groan-worthy moment where the android character literally said, "Get away from her, you bitch." There was like a huge pause, and I'm like, please don't say you bitch, please don't say you bitch. And then he says it, and it's just like, ah. And again, I really liked that movie, but there were so many fan service choices, especially one big one. If you've seen the film, you know it, and I don't want to spoil it because it's kind of a reveal, that I think really made people feel like, okay, this is a movie trying to do that nostalgia thing. Now, ultimately, if you watch my review of it, I think there's enough in that film that distinguishes it, in that it's doing its own thing separate from the original Alien movie, that makes it worthwhile as its own piece. But certainly, yes, there was a lot of structural similarities and also the excessive fan service callbacks that did end up having it hew much closer to the original Alien films than obviously something, say, like Prometheus or Alien Covenant, or even Alien 3 and Alien 2, or Aliens, I guess I should say, as those were even kind of more hewing away from the formula of the first Alien than Alien Romulus was. However, this episode of Alien Earth, and I say all that as introduction, because this episode of Alien Earth is very much, I think, even more closely structurally mirroring that original Alien film. We have a bunch of crew members on a Nostromo-like ship. Some of them are working class, some of them are working for the company, and the xenomorph gets out and all pandemonium breaks loose, and one of them is a android/cyborg here in Maro's case, who is a very company man figure, who is a antagonist to our Ripley-style character here. So again, very structurally similar, even more so than Alien Romulus is. And yet, this episode also, while it does redo a lot of the kind of similar beats, there's enough here in terms of the character dynamics and interactions and where we end that I think allows this to distinguish itself in a rather unique way. However, it is much more hewing close to the original film. And I think ultimately what makes this episode overall work for me is that it is coming here in the middle of the season. Because one of the things that I really liked about the pilot episode was that we got only brief little flashes of the crew on the ship, and we sort of assumed that an Alien-style movie occurred in the background, and it just ended slightly differently with the Ripley-style character dying and the ship crash landing on Earth, but ultimately the same beats were happening. And that's all we needed to know to sort of get into something that's different and new. And if the show had started off with this episode, I think a lot of people would have understandably felt like, okay, is this just redoing the greatest hits of Alien and we're not going to get anything new? So I think having this episode here was ultimately a smart move. And I really enjoy a lot of what this episode does, and I'm going to go through a lot of it beat by beat, especially in how it does different things from Alien. But there is a part of me that goes, there's not a lot that this episode adds to the overall larger narrative of what we've been watching with Alien Earth. In fact, it's a complete kind of turn to do a different thing. And I'm not saying it's 100% irrelevant. I mean, the major things that we learn here is we learn a lot more about Maro as a character, which I did really like to see. You can see how much of a company man he is and how much he is invested into that identity, especially as we see he has that flashback moment with his daughter, and then we learn that his daughter died very, very young. And it adds an interesting layer to this guy who you think he it's presumed he went into space knowing that he probably would miss most of his daughter's life. I mean, got a 65 years contract. So he already kind of knew that his daughter wasn't going to have time with his daughter, and his daughter was going to be either dead or old by the time he got back. But I think it hits even harder knowing that she didn't even get to have a life. And so what was he ultimately doing all of this for? And he doubles down on the company. That being said, it is reiterative of some stuff that we already learned, because we already had it, told to us to a degree, and this is showing us a little bit more, but we already kind of knew, this is a guy who has lost everything, and he just wants to, all he has is the company. So, but we do get to see a little bit more of how he acts in that role, because for the most part, we've only seen him in a super stressful situation post the crash, and also dealing with the kids. But here we see how he's willing to always use the rules to follow what the company wants, and there's that wonderful moment with the acting captain, the Ripley-style character here, where he forces her to enact an emergency so that he can use the regulations to start an investigation, an official investigation into who sabotaged the ship. And again, it's like he's following the rules to the letter, but he's so aggressive in enacting it, willing to dock people's pay and things like that in order to follow the complete letter of the law of the company. And it's just that is very fascinating to see with his character, of how much he has sort of killed all of his relationships to other human beings just to become this kind of machine. And it leans to this question, he is a cyborg, literally, like half man, half machine, but in a lot of ways, he is one of the more inhuman characters on the show because he has cut himself off from connection and caring. And I found that to be just a fascinating dynamic to watch. I will say, though, the one scene that we got at the end of the episode set during the present day timeline of the show, I didn't particularly love, mostly because it reveals that Maro apparently was actually a personal favorite employee and security officer of the Yutani from 65 years ago, the grandmother of the current day Yutani. And I don't particularly love this just because it makes Maro a little bit more special. Not that he's a chosen one by any means, but there was a part of me that found Maro a little bit more interesting, that he was just, when he came across more as just some guy who was working for the company, and yes, was on a presumably decently important mission because of getting these aliens back to Earth so that Wayland Yutani could use them, but he was just another company man instead of someone who was handpicked by Grandma Yutani and was close to her, at least in she trusted him heavily sense, so much so that her granddaughter would recognize Maro in some way. And I get that there was little hints of this throughout the season. It's not completely out of nowhere. But I don't know, there's something more interesting to me about just a guy who's so heavily invested in a company and has subsumed his entire identity into it. And to the company, he's just some guy, some guy that works for them, rather than being someone that yes, my grandmother really knew you and cared, thought you were one of her best employees. And not that I think that Yutani or even Grandma Yutani that we don't see, but we just hear from, ever considered Maro a close personal friend or anything more than a resource or employee to utilize. But the fact that he was sort of handpicked and well known kind of things adds a layer of specialness to him that I think is actually less interesting to me. I think it is actually just more interesting if he was just some random employee who happened to be on this mission that is so gung-ho for the company, and the company is just who are you again? Sure, yeah. If you're working for us, great. Yeah, definitely, we'll follow you. But actually doesn't give a shit about him. Again, I don't think this company really does, but it gives him a little bit more of a special connection than I think is needed, I think. And then the other thing that we learn here is sort of the big reveal is that Boy Cavalier was the one that engineered this crash in the first place. And I did kind of like the reveal here of how much Maro was suspicious of every single character on the ship that he was interacting with, and yet it was someone who had nothing to do with anybody. he was just a guy that was waking up out of his pod and trying to crash the ship for Boy Cavalier. So I like that as a twist for Maro of how he's just suspicious and didn't trust anyone, and ultimately it was no one that he was interacting with that caused it. And then also we get the reveal that Boy Cavalier has been playing this innocent, like, oh, it just accidentally fell in my space, and I get to just to take the spoils of war of this accident that occurred, when he was the one that engineered it in the first place. And so it goes to show, like, we've had these conversations about this guy being like, oh, it was dumb. And I know I've seen some discourse on this too. It was like, oh, he's dumb for sending his androids into get the aliens, and he's being reckless, and this is a dumb way to use these androids. But again, here we are seeing reiterated over and over and over again that Boy Cavalier is very cavalier. He is this kind of like, he styles himself as, I'm a great risk taker. Like, again, all these tech oligarchs like Elon Musk or Sam Altman, it's like, you got to disrupt and be taking risks, and you're not actually thinking, you're just doing disruption for disruption's sake to make yourself feel like you're innovating for innovation's sake. And it's ultimately not even helpful to the things that you are doing that are somewhat interesting that you already want to kind of capitalize on. And it runs at counterpoints to your own intentions in a lot of ways. This endless kind of innovation growth and, whatever techno Silicon Valley mindset that is sort of put on speed here in the Alien universe. So that was really, those were the like big reveals of this for me. But the rest of the episode, while I enjoy the dynamics of it, it is a bit superfluous to the larger narrative of the show. And so this does kind of become like a little self-contained bottle episode within a series that I kind of want to get to the point of like, oh, I want to see where the plot's going. And this flashback, I think, stalls that pacing in a way that frustrates me a little bit. Like, again, the episode itself is good on its own, but I kind of want to see where we're going next and kind of get to it. And this kind of is apropos really of nothing much going on in the plot of the actual show. Like, there's nothing that, instigated this flashback like last episode that I felt like, oh, I needed to see what happened to understand the context of the rest of the show. So this is just kind of feels like, oh, we're going to go do this now. It'll give you a little bit more of what we're doing, but it's not necessarily 100%. I mean, it's relevant, obviously, but like in terms of giving us things that we need for the plot and to keep things going and to keep things moving in a way that I find interesting, this isn't entirely relevant. And again, while I find the stuff interesting in some dynamics that it gives us, overall, I think it's a little bit of a swerve that I 100% didn't need it, even though I really like the episode on its own terms. Speaking of, let's talk about some stuff. I mean, a lot of this is going over the same beats, but I enjoy some of the small stuff. Like, I don't remember all of their names, but I really like the sort of intern to the acting and the chief engineer on the ship, his sort of constant asking questions and not really knowing like the difference between biology and and the chief engineer giving him answers to those questions. We got a little taste of that in the pilot episode because it kind of speaks to, what we're seeing today of like how tech oligarchs like Elon Musk and, the Republican Party too as well are like dismantling the Department of Education. They want to keep the working class uneducated so they won't be able to think of new ways, new things to break out of their environment. They'll never learn Karl Marx, right? They'll never get exposed to new ideas, and so they won't be able to literally think of new ways that the world can exist and will just do their job. And I like seeing this, like, this chief engineer is the only one willing to educate this guy, and he's probably picked it up from his own sort of backhand knowledge that he's sort of been going through on all these missions over and over and over and over again. And him being like telling this kid, it's like, yeah, you're just going to get stuck doing this job over and over and over again for your pay. And it's just an endless cycle working for these guys. So I found that to be a really fascinating kind of dynamic with his character. The other elements, again, I think a lot of this episode comes down to just the small stuff that you see. Again, I forget his name, creeper guy, who's like watching over this pod, who is just kind of going around creeping. I'm so glad he got killed by the xenomorph first, because, man, that guy was such a creeper asshole. But I like that he's the one that Maro learns about, like, the guy sneaking out from his pod from. We also get the acting captain, who, again, sleeping with the captain who died and got attacked by the facehugger. I liked her little thing of, like, putting sand on bodies as, like, a way to remember people, or as, like, a ritual. within this. And I liked that, she very much kind of had that Ripley energy of like, fuck the company, I kind of want to focus on what I want to do, but I also need to get my pay. And she's also a leader. Like, she has that very Ripley style energy that I really enjoyed watching here. She doesn't hew she's slightly different enough that, like, okay, she feels like her own character, but she doesn't hew so far away from the Ripley archetype that you don't kind of fully understand her character here. The other little elements that we get here, for the most part, are little more visuals and depictions of the other aliens besides the xenomorph. You get the eyeball guy taking over the chief engineer, which was suitably creepy. I also like that the eyeball clearly is very, very intelligent, because it sees what we ultimately learn of the tick bugs escaping, and it uses that moment to distract and try to distract the lead scientist to try to escape and cause chaos, and distract her from the other tick monster. So it's very clearly like able to think on multiple levels. So it is a very intelligent beast, and so I'm very curious to see, once it gets out of that goat in the present timeline, who it's gonna fuck up. I'm sure it's gonna fuck up with Boy Cavalier, because that'll be fascinating to see. But certainly it's gonna kill somebody, and I'm pumped to see that. The tick monsters were also really interesting, and I think that's another thing that I like this episode for, is that it adds new aliens to the mix. I said this way back in the pilot, but it's nice to see Alien as a franchise go beyond the xenomorph, because what made the xenomorph work initially was we didn't know what it could do. And part of the fear was discovering, like, how does this thing just work, and how is it ultimately going to kill people? But now we have seen the xenomorph so many times that, like, there's very few, there's some ways you can surprise us, like, Alien Romulus has a few twists at the end there that some people like, some people don't, but there are some ways that it can do a few new twists and turns, but for the most part, we understand the xenomorph. And so I think, just if we want to just take Alien as a literal term, I think this series expanding out beyond the xenomorph, I think, is a very smart idea. So getting to see these like tick things, like lay eggs in the water bottle, and that becoming this point of tension, like that Alfred Hitchcock, oh, I know there's a bomb under the table, it's going to go off at some point, sort of thing. That was a very fun moment. I was actually kind of heartbroken when it ended up being the younger working class engineer guy, because I was like, man, he deserved better. He was just a kid trying his best. So I feel like, and there is an argument, I think it kind of just skirts the line of this. You could argue that the show is being a little unnecessarily cruel to a character like him. Not just in, like, he dies in a cruel way. I mean, a lot of characters die in a fairly cruel way in this show. It's an Alien thing. What do you expect? But just some of the jokes at his expense, and sort of, I think we're supposed to get a little bit of humor of him. But I don't think the show ever necessarily looks down upon him. The characters certainly do. The show necessarily doesn't, but it does skirt on that line a little bit. But I think it walks it well. So there's that piece of it. Yeah, not a ton else to say. We have the doctor character. I will say there was a little bit frustrated when she gets distracted by her lunch at one point, and that sort of is what causes the tick be able to have a moment to escape. I also like that the ticks are also intelligent and able to open up jars and things like that. Like, again, humans underestimating these aliens because they look like bugs, but they're actually much more intelligent than we give them credit for, because we don't understand how their minds work. Like that sort of stuff. But her getting distracted by, especially in a tense situation of, like, there's an alien loose on the ship, and people are dead, I feel like it's just that sort of, like, level of incompetence that kind of annoys me. Thankfully, it's not hugely influential on a lot of things. Obviously, the tick and the eyeball monster are smart enough on their own that they have their own autonomy in getting people killed later on. So it is not fully just reliant on a character's incompetence to make the plot go forward, but it is a thing that's there that I don't love. But again, it doesn't lean on it too hard. So again, it's not the worst problem for me. The xenomorph at the end was cool. Again, it was sort of a longer extended sequence of what we already saw in the pilot episode, and I'm enjoying the xenomorph. I think there's people who like thinking like they don't like the xenomorph as much in the series. Like I said, I am less hyped on the xenomorph for the reason that I explained before. I know a lot of the xenomorph, so I think we get a decent enough moments with the xenomorph that I think are like, oh, that's pretty cool. I really don't expect the xenomorph to surprise me. at any point anymore. I think Alien Romulus kind of came the closest to still adding a little bit of freshness to it for me. There's also early in the season when they killed a bunch of like the French aristocrat looking guys in the top penthouse of the penthouse. That was kind of fun. But for the most part, I'm sort of like, yeah, this is good, and I'm not expecting phenomenal stuff from the Xenomorph, even though this is an alien show. I know that's kind of weird, probably, and even counterintuitive for a lot of you to hear me say, but really what I am here for is I really like the character interactions. I love the ideas of this show and all of the stuff with like the tech oligarchs and Boy Cavalier, which is again why I enjoyed this episode, and I think it probably will end up being a big hit. I'm curious to see if the discourse ends up being like people really like this one because it hews so closely to the original Alien. And I think that's totally understandable. It's a very solid episode on its own terms. But for me, what I've been finding most interesting about the show is the stuff that sort of takes a little bit more of a back seat in this episode outside of the character of Maro. And as a result, this one I enjoy, and I certainly understand it's a great episode within the bottle of its own self, but within the larger context of the show, I think for me, it's one of the ones that I'm like, okay, I liked this. Let's get back to the stuff I'm interested in. But that is my thoughts on episode 5, I believe we're at now, of Alien Earth. What did you think of it? I'd love to hear all your thoughts below. But beyond that, I hope you, my friends, live long and prosper.